The hardest thing about being healthy, living well, living up to the ideals and the values that we have is not knowing what we're supposed to do. The hardest thing is different for different people, but it almost always comes down to application. Sometimes the hardest thing has to do with dealing with the things that constrict us and limit our resources. I'm sure you've experienced this, that if you imagine that you had endless time and endless money, that you could probably come up with 6 different ways to better your health and imagine that things would feel a lot better. And it's probably true to some degree. Sometimes the thing that really limits us is trauma, pain, conditioning, or experiences from our past that we haven't been able to move through or let go, and we continue to react to the world in the same way, as if that thing was still happening. But we're not going to deal with either of those limitations today. Today we're going to deal with the one that I think is perhaps what I see most often. And it ranges from very, very mild forms to very, very intense, potent forms that take people's lives. And this is a phenomenon that I think is beautifully described by the allegory or the image of a hungry ghost, which is expressed differently in different forms of Buddhism, different forms of Buddhist thought. But I'm going to give you the overview of the idea, and I'm going to give you an example of a character who's like this archetype from a modern film. Maybe you'll think of some too. Hi, Kayla. It's so good to see you. So, in Buddhist thought, or in Chinese Buddhist thought, sort of popular Chinese Buddhist thought, it's the normal course of events is that after you die, you become a ghost. There's like a normal kind of ghost to become. And this has to do with a piece of your soul, there are different levels of the soul attached to different organs, not dissimilar from the ancient Egyptian concept of this. And that certain parts of your non-physical personality are more earthbound, and they take a certain amount of time almost to decompose or to sort of let go. And that this is natural, for there to be a period of time when you're sort of imprinted on the earth, and it takes a while for that to pass away, even after your physical body dies. And during that time, it is very important that your ancestors or your descendants make offerings to you and honor your memory and put out food for you and burn money that you can use, almost like use this money in the commissary in the afterlife. All of these traditions have to do with sacrifice and remembering. And that when this happens, when the person, the ghost, is honored, they're able to just slowly continue through their transition, and eventually they completely pass on to the next realm. But sometimes things happen and it interferes with this process. So if you experience a violent death or an unhappy death, or if your descendants neglect to honor you or leave things out for you, take care of you, if you allow the seeds of ignorance, anger, unhealthy desire to grow in your heart when you're alive, that will turn you towards evil, immoral actions that will then, any of these things can result in a person becoming a hungry ghost. And a hungry ghost is different from a normal ghost because they go around the world with skinny necks. They can't take anything in. And huge bellies, signifying their huge appetite. And they cannot experience fulfillment, satisfaction, or relief. They stay in this perpetual cycle of wanting and never receiving, never being satisfied. So on one level, this probably sounds very metaphysical and far away from our day-to-day experience. But I think that if we look at this idea symbolically, it actually tells us a lot about the origins of the things that keep us in this place of being hooked, really wanting and wanting and wanting, and never experiencing satisfaction or the ability to move on. And it is this pattern, these both hard and soft addictions, this continued wanting, never being satisfied, that I think very often interferes with our ability to live our values or our ability to tend to our wellness. A very, very simple example from my own life. I am really not a big drinker of alcohol for a number of reasons, but I've experienced a real opening in my social life in the last few months, and I found that I'm much more often, more days of the week than not, I'm having a glass of wine or two sometimes, and starting to notice that very quickly I'm getting into the habit of liking doing this and wanting to keep doing this, where I didn't really have that feeling before. And I've had a couple of evenings or nights where I thought, no, I shouldn't have a glass of wine tonight. I should, just skip it. And then some short amount of time later, I change my mind and I give in and I have one. And it's this pattern, that's a very mild example, but it's this pattern of feeling like I just want that one more thing, or I just want that experience, I just want that, I know it's not good for me, but I just want that blank right now because it would feel good, it would be good. And then on the other side of it, realizing that you really didn't get the satisfaction or the completion that you were looking for, or that was underlying that desire. This is what I see trip people up more than anything, and it's really tricky. So I want to tell you some thoughts about how we can connect this image of the hungry ghost to our day-to-day experience of hard and soft addictions. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that any of these ideas that I'm offering are sufficient to address a diagnosed addiction to substances or gambling or sex or anything like that. Addiction is an illness that requires treatment, and even still can be very resistant to treatment. So please don't misinterpret any of these thoughts as medical advice or psychotherapy or anything of that nature. But I think most of us who are here and who are watching are probably not struggling with a diagnosable addiction to something. and yet have those things in our life that are really hard to let go of, that we know are interfering somehow with our health or with our spiritual, moral development. That is what we're really talking about here, okay? So let's take out the metaphysics. Let's just set aside the idea that after you die, you become a ghost and you hang around and, you know, these things that happen. Let's set that aside and instead think of this metaphorically. So there are a lot of times in life when some part of us or some phase of our life dies in one way. And you can think of it as an ending, the completion of a chapter. In the beautiful book, The Anamkara, John O'Donohue talks about the idea that really every night when you fall asleep is like a death. It's the death of that day. And every morning when you wake up, the day is born anew and it's a rebirth. So when you come to the end of a relationship, when you come to the end of school or program of study, when you are having a really great time and it's time to go home, it's the end. There are a lot of different ways, large and small, that we experience a loss or a death or a letting go. And if we look at this story about how people become hungry ghosts, the first thing is if you have a violent death or an unhappy death, it can put you into this place of wanting and not being satisfied. So I think one piece of preventative medicine for our self-soothing tendencies that are not helpful is to look for those transition points in the day and in our lives where we know we're going to be experiencing some kind of little death, some kind of loss, and to tend those periods of time with a lot of care and compassion so that those are good endings, good deaths. The ancient Greeks had this whole concept of euthanatos. It's the word euthanasia comes from it, but it meant something quite different. That euthanatos, a good death, was what everyone aspired to, that you wanted to have a death that was actually like a microcosm of your life and everything that you stood for. That was the ideal. You can see how this would come out of any kind of warrior culture could do this, but it wasn't just for warriors. Sort of everyone wanted to have this, the death that would really just like drive the point home on their life. And I don't know how useful it is to think about our death as humans in this way, but I think it's very useful to think about for transitions. Teachers of mine, Swami Jyotirvakyananda and Swami Apipadananda, always talk about this sense that end games are the hardest. And when you're coming to the very end of something, coming to that point where you're ready to get the closure, you're ready to finally break free, you're ready to graduate, you're ready to whatever, there tends to be an intensification in the energy. And it's worth knowing that this is likely to happen. And it's worth planning and thinking through how you're going to summon your resources, both inner and outer, to make that ending as close to a perfect death for that chapter of your life or for that endeavor as possible. So, some things to think about with transitions. Number one, you want to make sure that you're sort of planning or signposting the fact that a transition is on the way. Sometimes we have a tendency to try not to think about it if it's something that we're not looking forward to, or we have a tendency to try to skip ahead, like skip over the details and imagine that we're already there instead of doing each of the things that we need in order to get there safely and well. So really giving yourself the structure to plan And thinking about, I like this question. I'm thinking about a client of mine who was in a work situation that she was very unhappy in and needed to stay in for just a short period of time more, but it was becoming more and more unbearable with every passing day. And so we set up the idea, or sort of a game for her, to look for the treasure that was still hidden in the last couple of weeks of time in this job. We made the assumption that if there was nothing left for her, she wouldn't be there anymore. It would already be over for one reason or another. And so we just made that working assumption and then said, okay, now your job is to get every lesson, to tie up every loose end, to say every thank you that you can say, to be impeccable with your work, and to do it as well as possible and get all of the lessons and all of the treasure out so that you can be done and move on cleanly. So these are just some examples I'm thinking through of transitions. It can also be helpful if, for me, the hard transition point will be if I am with someone and really love being with them and I don't get to be with them as much as I would like. And I know that the time is sort of coming when we're gonna have to say goodbye, but I don't know exactly when it's gonna be. Like, I know they're gonna have to leave, but I don't know how long it's gonna be. And it's like, I won't wanna acknowledge it. I won't wanna say anything because then I will be afraid that they'll leave, but then I feel bad because I don't want them to be out too late, and all of this sort of stuff. So what I have to do is know that this is my tendency, and this is me. This is a little bit of hungry ghosting, like kind of grasping on the person, like I don't want them to go. And so instead of doing that, I need to look and say, okay, I need to have a plan for what time our hangout is ending. And I also need to ask for the other person to let me know what their needs are around time so that I can plan and pace myself and know what to expect. So these are just a couple of examples, but we want to prevent violent deaths and unhappy deaths so that there won't be such a need to become that hungry ghost and reach for stuff to soothe and comfort us. Let me know if you have any questions or thoughts or feedback about that, or examples from your own life that connect to that piece of hungry ghost prevention. I'm going to continue because I'm noticing that the light is really going down in here, and that's probably only going to continue. So I'm going to try to move it along today. But I do want to hear what you have to say. Okay. So then what about this neglect of ancestors part? How does that possibly relate to our tendency to watch too many episodes of whatever the show is on Netflix? Just binge watch House of Cards until we're so depressed. It's very exciting, actually. My dad has been an extra on House of Cards now multiple times, like for 3 seasons. And I haven't watched it yet, but apparently the back of his head is prominently featured in many, many scenes in the Senate chambers this season. It's kind of cool. Okay, neglect of ancestors. How does this possibly relate to our tendency to binge on food or binge watch shows or get hooked to behavior patterns? On one level, I think we could read this as the importance of rich connections. that web of interconnectivity that supports life. It's possible in modern times to have the illusion, or the delusion really, that you're doing everything all on your own. But that's only possible because many of our vital relationships are mediated by the exchange of money. And so we don't think about it as being interdependent. Money just sort of makes us think about things in a different way, I think. So I could have the illusion that I'm teaching this class because of me, that I came up with the idea and I made the schedule and I showed up and I sent out the reminder email and all of this. Well, aside from the fact that I couldn't be teaching this class if you weren't here watching this class, I also couldn't be teaching this class if it weren't for all of the people who work at Verizon and keep my internet running, all of the people who thought of and developed the technology that is living inside of my computer that I barely know how to work, but I can press some buttons and it does things like magic. If it weren't for for the people who grew my food and transported my food to the grocery store, and the people at the electric company that keep my refrigerator running, very quickly you can start to make a list and see just how much of your life is dependent upon others, how interdependent we are. Never mind the fact of all of the people who've taught me everything that I know, taught me how to speak, taught me how to read, taught me how to think, taught me about herbs, taught me about hungry ghosts, taught me about dopamine and how that works in the brain to relate to addiction. I mean, I couldn't do any of this by myself. I'm never doing any of this by myself. But when I forget how connected I am, it's easy to feel kind of empty and like there's that hungry ghost belly is saying that it wants to be soothed or filled with something. Simply reaching out and connecting with others is a cornerstone habit to preventing the kinds of self-destructive, hungry ghost behavior with food or sex or gambling or alcohol, anything. This is a cornerstone of all 12-step recovery programs. This sense of fellowship and community, connection with others, always having somebody that you could call. This sense of relationship is so important. And it's been really demonstrated pretty robustly in the lab using rats that if you take rats and put them in a wonderful rat environment with lots of stuff to explore and places to go and play and other rats to relate to and have adventures with and do whatever kinds of things rats want to be doing. The rats who live in an environment like that are resistant to the effects of addiction if they're given, usually I think they use cocaine with this, but if they're given, cocaine, the ability to self-administer cocaine, they won't do it. They won't even do it. Where rats in a deprived environment where they're isolated and they don't have, the stimulation and the connection with other rats, those rats will self-administer cocaine until they die because they won't drink water and they won't eat. So in order to have our desires oriented in a healthy way, We need relationship. We need our descendants to feed us. So we need to give what we have to give, create things in the world, and then notice the ways that those creations of ours come back to nourish us, to offer something back to us. Kayla says, the hungry ghost makes a lot of sense in my life. I tend not even to acknowledge some things end, so the hungry ghost can sneak up on me. I think that this reminds me to notice the completion and the endings every day. After I notice when endings occur, I can start preparing for a closer to perfect ending, aka satisfaction. Oh yeah, Kayla, that's an awesome connection. Yeah, satisfaction is so closely related to ending, isn't it? The idea of like being satisfied at the end of a meal. And that when you notice that you're satisfied, it's the point at which you no longer want any more of whatever the thing is. So perhaps simply noticing, thinking about when the ending is coming, noticing what you still need, arranging to get it as best you can, and checking in and looking for that feeling of satisfaction. This helps us to take in the nourishment from our lives and from our experience. But then it also sort of puts a bookend on, it's like having the sorbet at the end of the meal and or brushing your teeth, and then like you don't want anything after that because you feel satisfied and it's complete, and it wouldn't feel good to have more. Yeah. So here's the other thing. This is the other thought that I have about ancestors, about needing the descendants to honor you so that you don't become a hungry ghost. I've been thinking a lot about traditions and how important traditions have been throughout human history and culture. And thinking about traditions in my own family, maybe some of you are at this same point in life, or remember this point in life, or you maybe are older but experiencing this in a different way. There's a sense of realizing that, oh, my family has certain family traditions that now are not going to happen very easily if I don't participate in remaking them and sort of keeping them going, but also inventing them anew. And I think that, one of the things that I have heard offered, I think that Janine Roth talks about this in her work on emotional eating, that living in a time when sort of all of our food cultures, in the United States especially, where this is so heavily a country of immigrants, and the food culture is kind of, there isn't just one uniform food culture, all of these different influences, and people feel pressure to assimilate and not have the same food culture as their parents had who originally came here. Or then there's no, families like mine that have been in place for some number of generations, there's not really a connection to a traditional food culture. There's kind of food culture as influenced by advertising and corporatism. And that in the absence of these traditions, it leaves us really vulnerable. It leaves us really vulnerable and unsure about what it looks like in the rhythm of any given day to care for ourselves and offer ourselves food, and then there's a gap that makes it possible for us to get kind of hooked and caught up in, emotional eating or using food for reasons other than nourishment and sustenance. And it makes me think about all of the ways that tradition is missing in modern culture, here at least in the US. And there are certain traditions that I'm very glad we no longer practice. Sometimes, just because people have been doing something for a really long time, that doesn't automatically make it a good idea. However, I do think that we have to offer some serious consideration when traditional practices have been going on for thousands of years or hundreds of years. Like, well, why? We can't just write off our ancestors as being dumb and superstitious and like not enlightened by modern science, because I have a feeling that any of us could go back any number of generations in our family and find that people knew how to do a lot of stuff that we don't know how to do now. It doesn't only go in one direction, that like we know how to use computers and they don't. So I think that this image of the offerings from one generation to the next, we can see it as relationships in general being protective, keeping us from slipping into a place of addiction of any kind. But I also think that there is a whisper here of an invitation to look for the traditions that perhaps you rejected because you thought that they were old-fashioned or useless or superstitious or wrong. And to ask yourself, what's nourishing about this? What about this was food for the soul of my ancestors? What was the good thing that this tradition did or made possible? And only once you can see the good that it offered, do I think that it's wise to make a decision that could say, we'll let that go. Or, no, maybe I want to bring this back, but in a slightly different form. Okay. DH, hi. DH says, I'm wondering if this dynamic could be similar to deeper unmet needs of the soul. Ignored and unsatiated soul needs then might be acted out through desirous addictions of excess. Yes. I think that is very often the case. And I think that it's really tough to talk about deeper unmet needs of the soul for a couple of reasons. Partly because the way that we talk about this will be so influenced by a particular person's spiritual or religious life. And it's a little tricky to talk about it in a non-denominational way. But I think that, yes, the challenge with endings or transition, it's all a practice round for death, for like ultimate death. All of these little losses that we experience, it's all practice. So in the microcosm of what happens to me when I have to say goodbye to somebody that I'm hanging out with, that I don't see enough and I really want to spend more time with, that clinging that I want to do there, I can easily assume that's the exact same clinging that I would be doing tomorrow if I were suddenly dying and thinking about all of my friends and family and people and you guys, like all the people that I still want to be with, you know? We can assume that it will map perfectly onto actual death and ways that the soul feels incomplete or separate or not satisfied. Because if in the moment with my friend, as we're saying goodbye or we're approaching that time of saying goodbye, if in that moment I was in a place of spiritual wholeness where I knew that my friend and I could never be truly separated, that the love that we have endures across time and space and physical bodies being here or not here, that we are both held within the same, that we are both sort of children of the same divinity, always connected. If I was fully in that place, I wouldn't be like, oh, I don't want him to leave, you know? I wouldn't be having that clingy thing. And then further, if I could just think through and work through that piece, just acknowledging it, working on it in the microcosm way, I think it helps us to unwind and practice for the bigger challenge that's coming later. And I also think that it then, we don't have to act out. All of these behaviors, these hungry ghost behaviors, are acting out the feeling of emptiness and separation. I think that's what you're saying, DH. It's acting out that you don't have what you need something more or different in order to be okay. And it does come from an unmet need of the soul, or possibly from, maybe it's true that the needs of your soul are always being met if you go deep enough, to a deep enough level of reality, but that we get caught up in layers of illusion. I'm sounding really Buddhist-y right now, but that we get caught up in layers of illusion that separate us from that truth that the soul is always held and always nourished, always whole. I don't know. How's that answer working for you, DH? Please feel free to contribute your thoughts as well. If you can identify, in any moment, if you can identify the need of the soul that's going unmet, that's always the thing to go for. So you could ask yourself, what do I really need? What do I really want? But in my experience, a lot of times, if you're enough in the trance, that voice, the hungry ghost voice, is going to be real loud. It's going to be like, well, nope, like what I really want is 4 more cookies. Like, that's actually what I really want. My soul is fine. I would like 4 more cookies, please. Okay, Kayla says, talking about food and nourishment makes me think about how eating or drinking something that is prepared with love is a really satisfying thing for me. It actually doesn't happen all that much. So here's a question. This is beautiful, Kayla. So if you can identify a lack, if you can identify a gap where there's something that really satisfies you, that feels like it gets to a deeper level of your being. That's what I'm hearing in that, Kayla, that it satisfies you in a deeper level of your being. And sorry, my mom just texted me and it came up on the computer and distracted me. So you can then ask yourself the question, how could I more often have the kind of nourishment that I get from eating a meal prepared with love? And the key really is to stay in that question of how could it happen? Because what our defensive structures try to do is go, well, it can't happen because I don't live close to anybody who would cook me a meal like that, and because I can't cook, and because love that I offer myself while I make a meal doesn't do it in the same way, and because. So you have to stay in that open place of asking, how could I meet that need? Or how could I notice that satisfaction and see what comes up? DH says, this clinging feels similar to foreboding joy that Brene Brown talks about. It's probably a common dynamic in our culture with not enough and lack of enough genuine belonging. Yeah. I noticed earlier that your blank and empty looking background was quite ideal with the theme of Hungry Ghost. Did you plan this? Yeah, I've moved into a new house, and I plan to acquire things to put on the walls, but I'm practicing cultivating emptiness until I find just the right thing for each space. So I'm in my yoga room, and because this is where I try to do a lot of Hungry Ghost work on my own self, so it felt appropriate. And I'm very glad that the setting feels fitting to you as well. Yeah, foreboding joy. I'm gonna have to, I feel like I have heard her or read something of hers on that, but I'm gonna have to go and review it because I'm not drawing it all immediately to mind. Okay, so I want to end with a movie recommendation and an image, a Hungry Ghost image for you. If you have not seen the classic movie Spirited Away, the Miyazaki movie, you must do yourself a favor and see this movie. I don't care if you think that you don't like animated films, because that was the prejudice that I went into it with. And this is absolutely food for the soul, this movie. It's very magical, and it's very archetypally satisfying. And if you ever like anything that I have to say on any topic, you're going to like this movie. So I'm sure there's one of you that won't, and then you'll tell me, and that's fine. But most of you are going to like this movie. So there is a character who touches my heart so deeply in this movie, who is called, the movie is in Japanese. I've seen it with subtitles. And in the subtitles, the character's name is translated to No Face, a creature without a face. And the No Face kind of finds his way. He's like a hungry ghost. He's kind of ghostly. He has a thin little sort of shadowy body and a mask that looks like a theatrical mask, but not like a drama or comedy mask, except that it's neither drama nor comedy. It doesn't smile or frown. It's just sort of straight across with little cheeks. The No Face finds his way into this magical bathhouse and quickly begins wreaking havoc. He's very attracted to gold and shiny things and starts kind of going after, just going after these things until he is gobbling up the entire, like everybody and everything in the bathhouse. And the amount of suffering that he's wreaking around him is impossible to quantify. I mean, it's like a terrifying situation. And his appetite seems truly bottomless. So among the quests for the hero, who is a small girl, among her tasks is to sort of stop the rampage of the no-face. And the solution I find very touching. And I would like you, if you haven't seen this film already, I would like you to imagine what you think the possible solutions would be to having a hungry ghost run rampage through your house and eat all of the other creatures and all of the furniture and all of the guests. And it's a creature that you can't reason with. You can't tell him to stop. How do you actually interrupt this pattern with this part of ourself that in some way, like the no face, in some way there's an innocence about it. There is an innocence in this reaching out and grasping that we do and trying to feel better some way and creating havoc in our bodies and our relationships and our communities in the process. I want you to think through what the solution might be for something like that. And because of the nature of how our minds work, if you do that, whatever you write is probably an extremely insightful solution for how this shows up in your life. It will speak directly to this part of yourself. And then after you do that, go and watch Spirited Away and you will love it, and it may give you more thoughts. There are a lot of very potent images relating to the no face that I think are great fodder for this kind of exploration with yourself. Okay. DH says it's just preparing for loss. The foreboding joy, I think you mean. In regards to explaining foreboding joy, people aren't fully present to joys of life because they're distracted by over-preparing for possible loss or tragedy. Ah, yes. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, it's like that not letting yourself have something so that you can't lose it later. Yeah. And that definitely leads to hungry ghost behavior because it prevents satisfaction, prevents, the idea, leaving the slightly Buddhist flavor of this conversation for a moment and picking up a slightly Hindu flavor, the tradition in India has more to do with yes, there's a sense you must uphold the Dharma, you must uphold what you are meant to do, your duty, honoring your duty. But there can also be a sense that if you're hooked on something, if you're really still stuck on the fancy cars or the many attractive sexual partners that you could have or whatever, if you're really stuck on something in the material world, like hungry ghost style, there's a sense that perhaps part of your karma is you need to burn through that desire. So the teachers on the right-hand side of the path would say you burn through those unhealthy desires by not having them and doing the mantras and doing these, transforming that energy. That is totally valid. There is the left-hand side of the path that would say, well, if you have that desire, then what you must do is go so fully into that desire. I personally would advise doing this in your imagination rather than in the outer world. But you could want chocolate cake so badly But I guarantee that at a certain point, there would be an amount of chocolate cake that you would eat where you truly, truly would not want anymore, probably for a very long time. And it's a more dangerous path to try to indulge the hungry ghost out of its attachment. But I remember how comforting it was when I first learned how to drive and was driving on my own, and I was always afraid of getting lost. And this was back, in the Stone Age, when we didn't have cell phones and we didn't have stuff that navigates for us on the cell phone in the car. I don't know how I lived. I was always afraid of getting lost in the city and not knowing how to get home. And my dad told me one time, he was like, well, Melanie, the great thing about the city is if you get lost in the city, all you have to do is keep driving, and eventually you're going to not be in the city anymore, and you're going to make it to 695, which is the highway that goes around Baltimore. You're going to make it to 695, and you'll be able to see whether you go, which direction you go to get closer to home, and you will eventually get there. The only way you can stay perpetually lost in the city is if you keep turning and turning and turning and turning and turning and turning and go in circles. But if you keep going, you're eventually going to get through. And that was real. That was real advice that managed to comfort me with my anxiety about getting lost. And so if nothing else works, if nothing else feels accessible or possible, maybe you can trust that eventually your heart and your soul are going to want the real thing. Maybe it will be 20 lifetimes from now. Maybe the tradition would say you're going to come back as a hungry ghost first. Maybe you still aren't ready to give up a habit that is hurting you. And maybe, if I really mean what I said before about the idea that if we go deep enough, if we really go down deep enough under everything, that our soul needs are always met, that we're always connected, that you're never abandoned completely by the universe, then even staying as a hungry ghost is okay. Because eventually that will change too. All right, my darlings. Let me check this last couple of comments and then I'm going to get going. Okay. So would uncontrolled ghost be like an exiled part that goes on obsessive one-track desire binge and can't be reasoned with until a big part of all that backlog of unmet needs is symbolically met? Yes, I had to read that twice. Yeah, I think that can be, I think that's an example. I don't think it's always that dramatic. I don't think it's always that dramatic, but I personally, myself, find this sort of internal family systems language, or this sort of parts language, extremely helpful. Partly, I think it's because those are ways of symbolically representing distinct drives that wire together in our brains and nervous systems, and they do function quite like personalities. And if you can kind of open up and get some dialogue going between these competing desires, it does seem to allow for more decision-making and nuance. Now, I mean, when we're in the realm of what you're describing, DH, to me, that level of challenge is more than I feel equipped as a practitioner to work with by myself. So if I were in a place where I was experiencing that, and I'm saying this not so much for the original commenter as for others who might be listening, but if I was in a place like that, I would want a good psychotherapist on my team helping me. And if any of my clients were experiencing that level of hungry ghost possession, I would want them to have a good psychotherapist on their team too. Or maybe really good pastoral care, really good spiritual support that's also informed about counseling. That might also be possible. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much for being here and for listening. Watch Spirited Away. Do that little exercise, thinking about what your no face would need in order to stop eating everybody and calm down and relax and feel peaceful again. And we have one more class in this series, and it is going to be next week. And it is called How to Be a Human. And I'm excited and nervous about it because it connects to a lot of my thoughts about creativity and stories and why even bother healing in the first place. If this world is just so full of problems and suffering, why bother? So I'm excited, and we're going to conclude this live series next week. So I hope that you can be here, and I look forward to seeing you then. Okay. Good night, everybody.